As the Prime Minister globetrots, Australians are suffering with the 13th interest rate rise today in 18 months. The Reserve Bank lifted the cash rate by 0.25 percentage points, taking it to 4.35%. This after a 4-month pause. But families are now at breaking point with this cost of living crisis. After today's rate rise, the average borrower on a $500,000 home loan will be paying $1,210 more a month since the start of the rate hikes. And if your loan is $1 million, your mortgage repayments will be $2,420 a month more expensive, according to RateCity. Today's rate rise was the first for new Governor Michelle Bullock, although she was there through the other 12 as Deputy Governor at the RBA. Economists are now warning there could be yet another rate rise before Christmas at the RBA's December 5 board meeting. So why was this rate hike today necessary? Well, inflation remains high and even increased in the last quarter. Underlying inflation is 5.2% for the year to September, down from its peak of 7.8% last December. But with inflation still rising, when it was meant to be falling by now, it's going to be impossible to get it back to that 2 to 3% target band in 2025 without these rate hikes. Now, as you'll remember, the Albanese government politicised interest rates when they were in opposition. They blamed Scott Morrison for the single rate rise of May 2022.
We also have rising inflation, and yesterday we saw rising interest rates. The combination of low wage growth, rising inflation and rising interest rates is putting real pressure on working families in the suburbs and the regional towns of Australia. And Scott Morrison seems to think that people have got it easy in this country. Scott Morrison has an excuse for everything and a plan for nothing.
And then on Twitter, Albanese said, at the time, Australians are being hit with a triple whammy of skyrocketing costs of essentials, falling real wages, and now an interest rate hike. They need a government with a plan to ease cost of living. In yet another tweet, Albanese said it was hard enough to make ends meet under Scott Morrison, and today it got even harder for millions of Australians. Everything is going up except wages, and now interest rate rises are part of the pain. Those tweets from May 2022, just before the federal election. But now that Labor's in government and have presided over a further 12 rate rises, it's a different story. The Labor government now blames global oil prices and the war in the Middle East. And here was the Prime Minister in Beijing less than an hour ago, shifting responsibility for this rate hike.
Well, the RBA, of course, are independent, but they have referred to in their statement that they're examining the impact on the global economy. We need to be engaged because we know that impacts of the global economy on energy prices, for example, feed through into the Australian economy.
Such anger at the first interest rate hike and barely any empathy for people who are struggling now that there's been 13 hikes, 12 under his watch. Well, economists disagree with the Prime Minister. They say the government needs to stop pumping so much money into the economy.
Glad to hear Treasurer Chalmers saying he's going to cut back on spending because that's also raising inflation.
The RBA can only raise rates to tackle inflation. It's their only lever. And they've raised rates 13 times. But economists say the single biggest factor within the federal government's control that's adding to inflation and therefore contributing to the need to raise rates is Albanese's high immigration policy. ABS data from September shows that our population grew 2.2% to 26.5 million people in the 12 months to March this year. Net overseas migration was up 103% from last year to 681,000 people this year. It's a record number of migrants coming into Australia, which is pushing up the housing demand, which is in turn inflating rents and adding to inflation. It's an issue I'll speak with economist Leith Van Onselen about later in the show. He says we have a burnout economy where the supply side of the economy is not keeping pace with the record immigration. So we've got a situation where the RBA is trying to hold back demand by raising rates, and the federal government, he says, has put the foot on the accelerator by pumping record numbers of people into the country. The RBA trying to slow the economy down in a per capita sense, but because the federal government is deliberately growing the population, it's working against the RBA. And before he left as governor, Philip Lowe said that solving the housing problem is one of the single biggest things the government could do to address inflation and then build transportation infrastructure to support it. He asked, and I'm quoting here, are there 2% more houses? That was in reference to the population growing by 2%. And his answer was no. It was interpreted as a veiled shot at the Albanese government. But the immigration surge continues, and we're tipped to see around 715,000 net overseas migrants into Australia this financial year. The RBA will have to respond by continuing to raise rates even higher, which will, of course, exacerbate the housing crisis. It's quite an absurd situation where the central bank is trying to move in one direction, and at least on this policy front, the Albanese government is working in opposition to it. One economist I spoke to today about this said, and I quote, "It's the stupidest policy he's seen in his lifetime." You have to ask why the Albanese government is overseeing this big Australia policy. And it could be ideology, but it could also be partly to keep us out of recession. We are already in a per capita recession, which means that the GDP per person is falling. It's why everyone feels worse off. But the total increase in migration can help the government avoid a technical recession because overall the economic pie is still growing. The high migration masks the economy's true performance. And on top of all of this, the Labor government is embarking on policies that are slowing productivity, like Tony Burke's IR reforms and some climate change policy. But the concern right now is that too many rate rises will put too much pressure on families and trigger a deep recession. It's a warning that Peter Switzer made yesterday.
If she raises, she could actually create a recession that we don't really have. So it's going to take courage to lean against, all the economists saying she should raise, but it also takes a lot of courage, to basically, gamble that we could end up in a recession. So it's a really tough call for the Reserve Bank governor. Wow. And by the way, Pete, Reserve Bank governors have been hopeless on interest rates. I've been a commentator for over 3 decades, and I've seen so many mistakes by RBA governors.
And yep, today we saw the 13th rate rise when families are already struggling with life, having to take on multiple jobs and facing, as a direct result of the rate rises, other costs, the soaring cost of groceries, power bills and petrol prices. Today's rise will make life far more difficult for families battling to find an extra $1,200 a month on the same salary, but with skyrocketing bills. And the Prime Minister seems to have forgotten his humble roots as he flies in a private plane all around the world. Since the Voice referendum, Albanese has been to Washington, now China, then he'll go to the Cook Islands for the Pacific Islands Forum, then to the United States again for the APEC Summit in San Francisco. In total, he'll be overseas for the best part of a month. It's not that the trips aren't important, but he does seem to have lost touch with the struggle that families, his voters, are facing. He was elected on a promise to make life easier, to make life more affordable for families. And instead, every facet of daily life is far more expensive, all under his watch. Now, we normally wouldn't blame the government for 12 rate rises over 18 months. They're only partly the government's fault. But Albanese didn't hesitate to sheet the blame home to Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg for just one rate rise early last year.
This is the triple whammy that Scott Morrison has presided over.
Under Scott Morrison, cost of living is in crisis.
This cannot be the thanks that Australians get.
Scott Morrison has an excuse for everything and a plan for nothing.
Scott Morrison's economic credibility is in tatters.